Myself and Andrew Saillant have made a second tier list. This time, specifically going to be about variables to consider when peaking into a powerlifting meet for the average athlete. So, essentially, how important are these specific variables in order to peak the best on meet day? So, our last tier list was more so how important are certain variables in terms of programming and how necessary those are to be kept in mind or to be kept in check in order to get programming to be the best it possibly can. Whereas this tier list is purely a powerlifting peaking variable tier list. Um, so we'll kind of cover that and the reasoning behind everything here, but here's a quick snapshot at the end result. My camera at the top left is covering the S tier, but um, one other thing to mention is the first half of the video, we forgot to record with our cameras in the video, and so you'll see us appear about halfway through. So enjoy the voiceover essentially for the first half. We are going to be talking over the entire thing. Our cameras just don't appear until about halfway through, but yeah, beyond that, I hope everyone enjoys the video. So I guess first one would just be general micro layout. So kind of like we talked about, the overall program, like how dialed is the program? Does it work for the athlete? Is the athlete making progress within that? And just the general structure of the microcycle as a concept, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, all the stuff that we talked about in the last tier list video, where we're just trying to look at programming in general, that is the most facilitative to athlete progress. And so, with that in mind, I think that this is easily going to be an A or S tier. But Devin was saying something before we got started recording that I will let him speak on.
Yeah, I agree. It's very important. Like, I think S or A is 100% gonna be the case. Um, Kind of like the first thought that I think anyone would think of is like, okay, this is like probably the most important thing peeking into a meet. Like, is the program working pretty much? And the variables going into that, are those dialed in? Are those consistent and predictable? But if we're purely basing this tier list off of does the athlete come in peaked on meet day? Does the are these variables going to play a significant role into specifically peaking or not? My argument would be that the overall structure of the microcycle and if it's working or not is important, but if we're talking specifically about peaking, how important is it to have that dialed and then have someone peak into a specific day or a specific meet within that? So, like for example, maybe someone's one rep max is 180 kilos, but during prep, we're really struggling with like the 165, 170 kilo range because the general micro layout and the programming overall is not dialed. It's not like we're not at like A plus territory there, but we peak in a way to get the athlete back at 180 on meet day, say like the most they've touched all prep. So how much does that really play a role into specifically peaking? I'm not entirely sure if again if that's going to be an S tier thing specifically for that. So that's my argument, and I think it does make sense. But again, we can't peak into a meet. There is no peak if there's no strong training to peak from. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. You need programming to be at least some level of predictability, but I think what ultimately you're trying to argue is that you can have programming not perfectly dialed in for that athlete, but still peak really, really well into a meet.
Exactly.
Um, but it's contingent upon that you have at least something that works somewhat well.
Right.
So I think, yeah, like you said, if there's no baseline, there's nothing to peak from. And so I think that that puts it into that A tier, but the fact that you can have things not perfect, but still peak really, really well, I think just slightly takes it out of that S tier. So I'm going to go ahead and put it right here at the top of the A tier.
Yeah, and if we find that like we are talking more about certain things and think about it more, it can get bumped up or something like that. But I agree, like probably A tier, and then that one concept, I guess, takes it out of S for the time being for sure.
Mhm. All right, so next one, competition equipment access. This is basically like how uh, how accessible stuff like a combo rack, a competition power bar, kilo plates, a good deadlift platform with a carpet, how accessible that stuff is for an athlete. Um, and I think it's probably to nobody's surprise that this is not like the most important thing to consider when it comes to programming and for peaking, but it is definitely important to take into account to some degree. If somebody is, for example, like the only access to a gym that they have is a commercial gym, and that's what they're going to be training on for the majority of their prep, then or all of their prep, then there are some considerations that you might have to make when it comes to programming, like maybe just taking into account that uh, bench numbers might be a little bit deflated than what they would be in on a combo rack, or that maybe deadlifts you can't do as many reps as you would like because they have those hex plates or something like that that bounce all over the place. So, I think there are considerations that have to be made, but at the end of the day, like what you have access to is what you have and you got to work around it regardless. So I think that it's something to keep in mind, but it's really not at all on the forefront of decision making when it comes to programming. But because there are those slight things to consider, I'd probably put it around the C tier mark, C or B tier mark.
Yeah, I agree. Probably C or B. I think another thing to mention is say someone just straight up never trains on competition equipment. Maybe they're a commercial gym warrior who that's like the baseline of equipment access that they're on, you know. Maybe they've never touched a kilo plate or a power bar in their entire life. For that type of person, it probably doesn't matter at all. Like, immediately goes in F tier because they've never used it, and probably just the fact that they would be on it for, I don't know, meet week or the final block probably won't make a difference because they're so used to like the commercial gym non-comp specific equipment. But for the people who train like regularly at a powerlifting gym, and maybe like for example, a good example is a student who might be competing at the end of a summer. End of the summer, they go home from school. Maybe they start training in the commercial gym for 3 blocks in the summer. That can really screw with someone's prep. So I think it really depends on the situation. So yeah, I agree. Like B or C, really dependent. Again, might be something that moves or shifts around or something like that based on how other things are rated. So
I'll put it in C for now. It's like you said, it's important to consider. It could derail things in the right situation, but it could also not really matter at all.
right. Cool. So similarly, training environment, I suppose we can classify as like everything environmentally outside of the equipment. So like, are the vibes at the gym good? Do you have good people to train around? Um, is that consistent with what you're used to in terms of your training environment? In my opinion, this is less like objective and less, I guess, needed to elicit performance within a certain skill. It can just kind of be like a global interference of things. But again, we're talking more so like something that's relatively within an athlete's control. Whereas if someone doesn't have access to comp equipment, they can't control that. It's like like you mentioned, you got to work with what you have. But for the environment, and just the vibes, I guess it's, it can be really important for some people. And, maybe, I don't know, like they're used to training with a bunch of people who help them out and spot them. I actually have a lifter competing this weekend who did not have spots on their final couple like bench sessions, and that really messed with them. So there's definitely a couple reasons why this might impact someone like crazy, but I just ultimately don't see it as valuable as the comp equipment access.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It's definitely towards the bottom of the tier list. I think that really the only programming consideration I would have surrounding this idea is like if basically like to what top end intensities we could push like a squat or a bench. And around basically around the fact that is this person going to have spotters that are reliable? especially on squat and bench. Like if we're dealing with a really heavy squat, 500 plus, can we get five good spotters that are going to be reliable and help you in the unfortunate case that you miss?
Right.
Same deal on bench, people that are not going to touch the bar or anything like stupid like that. So like it's not to be completely ignored when it comes to programming, but I think that at the end of the day, it's this is probably like an F tier thing for the
I
most part.
agree. Especially just compared to everything else we have laid out here, this might arguably be the least, if not one of the least most important things. So just relatively speaking, I think that can definitely be in the lowest tier.
Yep.
Cool.
All right, block timing is the next one that we have coming up, and I think that um, just to preface what we really mean by block timing here is like how we're timing multiple blocks going into the meet, and really um, probably for the most part lining up that final block of the prep to have it so that you're either having your final week of that block a week out for an additional taper week method or with meet day directly if you're doing a training in strategy. And this is probably like one of the most important things on this list. Like if you mess up block timing to a real extent, um, there's probably not a ton that you can really do to salvage that person's prep, aside from like really interfering with the programming and trying to get them to either peak early by adding in a ton of workload or delay peaking by just trying to push progressions a little bit longer. But I mean, if you're doing a train in method with somebody and they peak predictably on week 4, really strong, they have multiple primary days on Saturday, um, and you mess it up and you're putting it so that it's going to be their week 3 on meet day or that their week 4 is going to be a week early, like there's that's going to be tough to come back from. So I think that this is um, easily top of A, if not S tier.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely one of the more important ones. And again, all of these obviously depend on the athlete and depend on the individual. Like for some people, um, like I don't know, there are some people where like the performance really doesn't fluctuate week to week throughout a block, especially like for newer people where like this more structured macro cycle development is not as vital for a person. Like say someone is brand spanking new to the sport, it's their first meet probably doesn't matter that
Mhm.
much. But, for the average powerlifter, I think is what we're going for here. And we're talking peaking. So how peaked is someone going to come in? Uh, Regardless. So like if block timing is not taken into account, will that person come in strong on meet day? Possibly, like kind of a coin flip, but even if it does happen, will that person come in as predictable as possible, as strong as possible? Probably not, unless you are really dialing in that block timing. Personally, I like to like plan the timing of blocks out, like a full macro cycle at least ahead of time. Like usually the second someone signs up for a meet, unless it's like, I don't know, 8 months in advance or something crazy, then I'm gonna start timing things into the meet. Just based on how important it is. So I agree, like I think probably like S tier in some fashion, whether that be what we end up deciding to be the most important thing or just somewhere as one of the most important. But I agree, like S tier for sure, super important here.
Yeah, 100% agree.
And I think block length is the next one, and I think that is similar. It goes hand in hand with block timing, but it's more so like a result of timing those blocks,
Mhm.
if that makes sense. So, for example, like what we were talking about before we hit record is say someone has like a 12-week prep and they're training into the meet. So, like that final session of those 12 weeks would be meet day, like the week 4 Saturday or week 4, whatever day it is, for meet day. You don't really need to adjust anything in that 12 weeks because block timing it just kind of naturally fell into place. Um, and you don't need to touch that. So that doesn't need to be as counted for because it's already there. However, say you've got like a 14-week prep with someone, you've got another 2 weeks to do something with. And if you end up just running 3, 4 week blocks, guess what? Meat day is going to land on a week 2. And then that goes back to the whole block timing component where, you're stripping so much predictability from the performance on meet day if you do not account for the length of each block when you're timing each block. You know what I mean? So block timing is one thing and planning that out in the first place, but having block length isolated, so like for example, maybe that 2 week block, if it's strategically placed at the very beginning of the prep, that probably is not going to mess with anything. You know, it just allows the block timing to be accounted for. However, that the length of the block itself being at the very end, like I said, where you've got that 2 week block and you compete on a week two, that's when it can be a big deal. So if we're specifically isolating the block length, I think it really is just kind of like a subset of the block timing, but the block timing is what ultimately matters.
Yeah, I agree. They're definitely very closely related subjects, but I think that the one, I guess, unique aspect I'll bring up is going like that final week of or final block of the prep. Depending on what sort of peaking strategy you're using, you may have to change block length from what you typically do, especially if it's your first time peaking somebody into a meet. Like if you typically run 4 week blocks, and you're just kind of you don't have a ton of peaking data, so you're going to go with an additional taper week peaking strategy, then obviously that block length is going to change. You're going to have to line it up so that you have 5 weeks for that last block going into the meet. So where you can actually have that week four be done a week out, and then have an additional taper week tacked on. So block length is it's sort of a byproduct of block timing and also general micro mesocycles and sort of the general peaking strategy. So it's related to all of these things, but um, in itself, I don't know that it makes a huge um, difference individual from all of those other things. But when it's taken into account as a system, then obviously it's very important. So it's less important than block timing, I think, and it's probably right up there with general microcycle because of how related they are. So I think I'll probably go ahead and put it right in that A tier if you agree.
Yeah, I fully agree. Definitely A tier, maybe like very end of like S tier thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good spot for it.
Okay,
Cool.
so next one that we have here is the primary day progression. So this is another variable that we just took from the previous tier list. And basically it's just uh, how much you're progressing your primary day on each lift throughout the block, and then really, I guess in this context, throughout a macro cycle as a whole, peaking into a meet. Um, and so basically talking about like weekly jumps per for the primary day and sort of like what RPEs you're hitting, what sort of intensities. And I think that this is another super important thing. If you're not touching heavy enough stuff at the correct time, then the person is just not going to be prepared to execute top end lifts, 101, 102, 103% of their 1RM on the platform. They just won't be prepared enough for it. They won't have that central nervous system conditioning. At the same time, if you progress them too fast and you hit stuff that is too heavy, a week out, a block out, they might not be able to recover from that in time to perform on meet day. So, um, smartly, intelligently progressing your primary days, making sure that the athlete is hitting the um, desired necessary threshold for performance without the drawbacks. I mean, I don't know that it really gets all that much more important than that when it comes to long-term planning for peaking into a meet.
Yeah, 100%. I think you said that pretty much exactly how I would have. Like, I like what you said in terms of if you're not touching heavy enough loads at a correct time, or if you're touching too heavy loads at incorrect times, that can really just it can just completely screw with meet day, and especially during like the final block of prep, you can completely screw things, and meat deck can come in the weakest thing on the planet and not peak at all if you mess with this. So I think this is probably going to be our most important one, at least for the time being.
Yeah. And no, I'm actually going to go ahead and slide block timing over
Yeah.
and toss this guy right in there.
And similar to that, non-primary, I think is a similar boat. I think what makes primary day progression maybe a little bit more sensitive in terms of how that influences peaking on meet day is that it's probably higher intensity, therefore elicits a more sensitive outcome. Like you're gonna have these top sets with which create fatigue or lack of fatigue. Um, and I think that's pretty significant. And the non-primary stuff uh, is probably just essentially we're talking about probably lower intensity top sets or back off work or whatever. Um, but yeah, like it can completely screw with the performance of that primary day. Um, Completely screw with the performance of meet day. So like I don't know if you go from changing the structure of that too much, then you're ultimately missing the forest for the trees, and you're missing the foundation that's needed for these top sets in your primary day to actually be progressed in a good way. So I do kind of actually see that might be an argument to be made for it to be even more important than primary day progression, but I think they're about the same in terms of importance. Like, I think we can kind of classify both of these in terms of load progression going into meet day. And it really is just a matter of like how we view these for a certain athlete and how necessary they are in terms of coming in as strong as possible on the day. So yeah, I can see it honestly being more important than primary day progression, but also not, you know?
Yeah, I think the real difference here is that when it comes to the primary day progression, I think we're looking more so at like peak intensity in the week versus non-primary is a little bit more skewed towards average intensity throughout the week, and how you're progressing that. And I think that probably when it comes to peaking specifically, I think that the primary day progression, i.e., peak intensity, is probably a little bit more important. And generally, when you're peaking for a meet, it's not a super, it's not a particularly long amount of time. So if you're looking to maybe progress the non-primary stuff um, a little bit more so, than you would in sort of like a normal like off season.
Mm,
I think you can probably get away with that for a little bit longer, um, than you would in other words, just because you're training that you're taking that progression into a meet and knowing that you're going to pull back on it afterwards.
right.
And so I think that for that reason, like you can probably get away with a little bit more non-primary progression, but you're not going to be able to do it as long. But then you also could run into that issue where you start to progress that stuff too much, and it ends up being, I think this is what you were getting at. It ends up being too much for that lifter, and then their primary day starts coming in overly fatigued or something like that.
Right.
And so I think that because there is that reliance on the primary day progression, on the non-primary day progression, then I would say that they're of equal importance.
Mm,
Uh, but I think that at the same time, making sure that you're getting those exposures to the peak intensity is probably edges it out just a little bit more,
mm.
because we're talking about hitting peak intensity on the platform. Um, so I think my vote would be make a little spot right next to it here.
And another thing to add with that is like I feel like that kind of stuff is more like it can fluctuate more and it has a little bit more room to be adjusted throughout a block. Like say like that specifically that final one or two blocks of prep. Say someone um is coming in too beat up or the opposite, lacking stimulus to an extent. I feel like there is more wiggle room for us to adjust that to get the primary day to show up better, if that makes sense. Whereas like the weekly jumps on this primary day, especially during the final one or two blocks, um, you know, touching that is probably going to take away from predictability more, as opposed to like, okay, you're coming in a bit too beat. Let's take one or two RPE off of these back offs on this secondary day. You know what I mean? So I feel like there's more room to touch the secondary, non-primary, whatever stuff, as opposed to touching the primary stuff.
Well said. All right. Next variable here that we'll discuss is like weight cutting and weight cutting considerations. So this is something that obviously starts to take into effect in the last week or so of the prep. Um, and I think overall this is really not something you have to consider super really at all when it comes to programming. Usually because when that weight cutting is happening, athletes maybe have 1, 2 sessions while they're, in that real weight cutting phase. I guess, it depends on what strategy they're using. But if it's a water cut strategy, then we're cutting water off a day early at the very most, and usually people aren't training a day early. If you have somebody who's like super high frequency bench, you might have a little like a last session going on that day. But I really think overall that this is really not going to have a big impact. And if somebody's gut cutting, then, if anything, they might get a little bit of boost to training, because oftentimes you can get away with a little caloric surplus when you're gut cutting. Um, but the weight cutting stuff is so short term that I don't think it has too big of an impact on peaking. Um, Unless you start to talk about rehydration, which I didn't really think about that until right now, just talking about it. But if you mess up rehydration, that doesn't necessarily affect the peak itself, but it affects your ability to perform the peak, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think we can kind of classify like the whole recomp process within weight cutting, like it just kind of as one variable. We can also probably separate them, but yeah, I agree. Like just the weight cut concept as a whole, if you do that horribly, or if you also just starve yourself the week of the meet, well, there you go. There goes every other variable that would peak you into the meet otherwise. Like that's crucial. So I can see an argument for this to be placed, honestly, anywhere, just depending on how you cut into the meet. But yeah, man, if you do it in the dumbest way possible, like you just, I'm gonna eat 1,000 calories less for the final 3 days of prep because I'm heavy. There goes your meat.
Yeah.
You will not come in peaked.
Yeah. I guess I didn't even consider that. I was just assuming that these people were using um, good weight cutting strategies. But yeah, that could totally derail you. Like if you stop drinking water for 2 days and
Yeah.
slash your calories in half, you are not going to come in peaked at all. Um, and so in that sense, it could be really important. Assuming that somebody's using, a sound weight cutting strategy, then I think that there shouldn't really be any effect on the peak. Um, Maybe just some slight modifications, depending on how rehydration goes. But
Mhm. Yeah, and then there's also like someone can come in really strong and peaked on meet day, but maybe the recomp didn't go as well and they're just cramping the whole day.
yeah,
So how much is that like a peaking thing either? So I don't know. I can see this being anywhere in between like a B and an S tier, to be honest.
yeah, just put it right in the middle of the road.
Yeah, I'm down
Okay.
to we'll keep it at B and think on it, but yeah, I think it's so dependent on so many things and it encompasses a lot of things in general. So
Yeah.
yeah. So I think what we mean by general peaking strategy for our next one is how are we peaking into the meet? Are we doing a good old 3x1 at 65% once a week and only training once a week and then taking 6 or 7 days off before meet day? Are we training into the meet and having more of like a traditional, not traditional actually, modern day timing of things where that final day or final primary session, whatever it may be, is timed into the meet without any real tapering? Are we doing a additional taper week? Are we taking full rest? Whatever. So I think ultimately, again, if we're assuming the strategy to peek into the meet is sound and not, the dumbest thing ever, like, I don't know, something on the extreme, like, I don't know, we'll take 2 weeks off of training and come in peak to meet day. Probably not the smartest idea. Um, so if we assume it's sound, I think this is important, but I think it is ultimately the athlete can probably get away with doing either interchangeably if they are both executed well and executed correctly. Um, what I think is more important is everything we have in the S tier. So the timing of things, the primary and non-primary progression, and things of that nature. So those are my thoughts. I think it's important, but it's ultimately sometimes can be interchangeable and it might not make or break the meet. It just really is like how as predictable as possible can we come in on meet day and come in as peak as possible.
Yeah, I'd agree. I don't think that the general peaking strategy matters all that much, assuming that all of this other stuff is accounted for, whether or not you're um, doing an additional taper week or training somebody into the meet. I've had athletes where I've done both strategies with them and they've worked well both times.
Hmm.
So I think really just for that alone, I don't think that we can really qualify this as an S tier variable to consider. But again, this is assuming that sort of all other things are accounted for well, that programming in general is sound. Um, And so, yeah, I think that it's important for sure. It's important that you're actually taking a good general peaking strategy in itself. But I think that when it comes to the actual peaking strategy itself, which one you're choosing, I don't think it matters all that much.
Right.
So I would probably have to put it um, in probably like the bottom A tier here. I think that all of this stuff is far more important in the S tier, and then that probably everything that we have in the A tier before it is also more important.
Right. Yeah, I think S tier, everything undeniably more important than that. I think A tier can, these are all roughly in my mind around the same importance. So yeah, bottom of A is I'm down for that. Accessory intensity. Um, that is going to be pretty simple. Like how hard are we pushing accessories? I think the biggest thing here is having specific accessories be pushed versus non-specific accessories. So I think for some people, again, it can be really important. Say someone needs like a belt squat or a leg press pushed really hard to have squats show up very strong. And then all of a sudden you skip that during meet week. That's going to strip a lot of predictability and probably impact the peak going into the meet pretty substantially. Whereas you probably don't need to be pushing bicep curls to failure the week at the meet. So depends what accessories we're talking about. Um, so I think just with that said, I think this is probably like a C or a B tier, where again, I don't think it applies to everyone as much as these S tier things that we have do. Like again, not everyone needs to push a certain accessory super hard for a certain lift to show up very strong on a day. But it is often the case. So I think C or B, depending on how we want to view this.
Yeah. And we do have an accessory selection variable as well. But I think in terms of intensity, I'm thinking about this more so in the terms of like in the last block of the prep, in the last week of the prep, how hard are we pushing those, main accessory specific accessories versus the non-specific ones. I think it's definitely an important factor to consider, making sure that somebody doesn't come in too fatigued or potentially too flat if they have an accessory that really contributes a lot to how well their SPD lift performs. So I think it's important for sure, but it's probably not like not certainly not an S or an A tier. I would put it's probably more important than competition equipment access. It's probably more important than weight cutting. Um, so I'd say we'll put it in B tier. That would be my vote.
Sure. I'll put it here behind weight cutting for now because I think again these are kind of similar
Yeah,
to just these are just very like subjective in terms of how we can view them, but I'll just leave it here for now.
yeah, works for me. So next one we've got going on here is SBD specificity. So I think that what we're referring to here is essentially variations within your SBD work. Um, and I think that this is definitely a very important thing to consider from the perspective that just because you're getting close to a competition does not mean you have to strip away all of your accessory work to, for the sake of specificity, which I think is probably a bit of an outdated but common uh, trope or idea when it comes to peeking into a meet. If a variation is helpful for you for positional reasons, for load management reasons, um, then there's no need to change it just because you're quote unquote peaking. Um, so I think that um, at the same time, you could, if there are times where I periodize people's like hypertrophy work on bench. If I have somebody on like a 4 times a week frequency, and maybe in a quote unquote off season, I'll make that fourth day like incline bench or something like that. And then when we're approaching a meet, I'll bring it back to a flat bench and just keep the prescription pretty much the same, but make it a little bit more specific. I think overall that really doesn't do any harm. Um, so I think it's definitely an important thing to consider, but it's maybe like top of B tier, my opinion.
Yeah, I think it is very important. Like, it can be skewed. Like, maybe someone needs a certain like really needs a certain variation to come in with the highest level of skill practice on a certain day. And if we don't do that meet week, that can really skew with, technical proficiency or ability to maintain center of mass, what have you. So yeah, I think it is again, it can be important for some people, but compared to what we have in S or A, um, for most of those variables, I don't think it's going to be as important as that. So I think for me, this is probably like top of B, um, maybe even like bottom of A, but just in terms of like specifically peaking and coming in as strong as someone can on the day, I don't know if it's like as crucial.
Yeah. I could
So
rock the bottom of A tier because I feel like it's probably a more important consideration than weight cut or accessory intensities.
sure, let's do that. Cool. So yeah, similar to what we were talking about before, accessory selection is just going to be what accessories are we doing instead of how hard are we pushing them. Um, so I think this is also probably more important than the intensity component, but in the sense that again, maybe someone needs those bell squats to really, really show up strong. That's the added squat volume we need. Whereas maybe we don't do them the week of the meet, or we sub them for quad extensions, and some people are really, really sensitive to that. Whereas some people, it really doesn't matter. Um, so I do think it's pretty similar to importance of the accessory intensity, but probably a little more important in most cases.
Yeah, you nailed it. I won't really add anything else other than that. I think it's more important than intensity because you can, like using the belt squat example, like somebody may really, really need belt squatting in their program in order for the squat to feel good.
Right.
Um, but you can have room to play with that intensity a lot more than you can actually the exercise selection. So I think that immediately makes selection more important.
Right. Meet week frequency. So I assume what we're talking about here is how often are we training the lifts per week of the meet?
Yeah. And so these next couple are all like meet week specific stuff because typically within the week of the meet, you have to change some things around in order to get somebody's, primary days to line up with the day of the meet. And so frequency is one that I've actually had some experience like messing with in the final week of the meet, usually in the forward direction, meaning like I'm actually adding frequency a little bit when it comes to that the final week of the meet usually in the sense of like, if I have somebody typically squatting on, you know, Monday and Friday, for example, but they're competing on a Sunday, then something that I might do is have them do the regular secondary day on Monday. And then like on Thursday or Friday, do a little bridge squat session, which would, they're squatting a regular time in the week, and then they're going to squat again on meet day. So that would technically bump them up to a 3 times a week squat frequency.
Hmm.
The reason I would do that is because I don't really want somebody who's typically having 3 days of rest in between squat exposures to all of a sudden go to 5 days of rest in between just because it's the week of the meet and you want to save fatigue or something like that. So I think frequency is an important consideration in the sense that you may have to mess with it in the week of the meet in order to get things to line up. But because you sort of have that wiggle room and sort of based on how you prescribe what is within that extra session or not necessarily an extra session, but you have some wiggle room with it. So I don't think that it's like, this sort of end all be all thing that you have to consider. Um, I'd probably put it bottom A tier.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this and meet week exposure timing are both pretty similarly important and go hand in hand. I think the frequency component honestly might be like I don't know. Again, it swings on a pretty significant spectrum, but yeah, I fully agree. Like there needs to be some adjusting, especially for like a higher frequency bench or something when primary session is not on the meet day already. There needs to be, maybe minus or plus one bench days to adjust for that. So I agree, like probably A tier somewhere towards the middle or bottom of it. Um, so yeah, we'll put that here for now. I think this honestly might be a bit more important. Wait, hold on, I just dragged the wrong one.
Yeah, you just put accessory intensity.
I think this might be a bit more important than honestly a couple of these, but we can leave it here for now
Hmm.
and adjust after. But I think exposure timing as well is one of them where, if we're trying to heighten predictability, this is S tier. Like, but peaking for meet day is we need to keep things predictable, but in order to come in as peaked as possible, the predictability component of things isn't necessarily like the end all be all for people. But if we want to maximize the certainty that someone is going to come in peaked, I think the exposure timing is very important. You know what I mean? Like, say someone does their, like, again, it comes on a spectrum. Say someone um, has like a Wednesday, Saturday squat, and Saturday is their primary day, but they do their final squat session on a Tuesday. It might make a big difference, but I don't know. For some people, it really doesn't matter. It might actually do them better. But say someone deadlifts like Sunday, Thursday, and they're competing on a Saturday, you might need to do something with that Thursday deadlift so they're not deadlifting 2 days out, you know? So if you do have someone deadlift 3 days a week, and have the final exposure of deadlift be 2 days out, that could be pretty significant. So I think it's pretty similar to the frequency.
Yeah, I think it has to go right with frequency, just because they go so hand in hand. I think that you probably have a little bit less wiggle room when it comes to exposure timing. Like you usually I'm messing with frequency because I want to dial in the exposure timing better. Which is like the same thing that I was talking about with the squat exposure, right? Like where I don't want 5 days of rest, I would rather keep that like typical 3 days of rest going into the primary. So then that is why I'm altering frequency in order to keep up with the exposure timing. So
Okay.
I would say if anything, let's flip-flop those, have the exposure timing come first
Sure.
before the
Yeah, I
frequency.
think they're very similar. Like you need the frequency to line up the exposure timing oftentimes, but ultimately, I think if we're talking predictability, the exposure timing is a little more important in some cases. So,
Mhm. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some tapering variables. So first, SBD tapering and then accessory tapering. Um, SBD tapering, so your squat, bench, deadlift work, how you're tapering that within the week is going to depend sort of a lot on the individual and how much fatigue that they need to be tapered and out in order to perform to their best ability. For some people, that's not a lot at all. And for some people, it's a ton. And it also kind of depends on the general peaking strategy that you're using. To where, if you're running somebody with an additional taper week, you're going to be tapering a lot more in that meet week versus if it's a train-in strategy, probably not as much, and you'll probably be tapering more out of the accessories. So I think just comparing this stuff to everything else that we have, I would say probably for both accessory or sorry, for both tapering variables, I would put them maybe top of B tier. I don't think that they're as important. The degree to which you taper somebody is individual, like I said, but I think you can get away with variations of how much you're tapering somebody, but all of this other stuff in S and A tier has to come first, essentially, in my opinion.
yeah, and the way I'm viewing the SBD tapering is if you've got the primary day progression, if you've got the non-primary day progression, if you've got the block timing, you probably won't, especially if you're training in, you probably won't need to do much tapering because you've
Yep.
got the more important things down. However, if you don't have those more important things down, there might be more that needs to be tapered
Yep.
off. Or if, same is true for the opposite. So I think this is one that's largely contingent upon more important things, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And same deal really with honestly like meat week accessory tapering that could maybe even go down to C,
That's
uh,
what I was thinking too.
just because like the the selection and the intensity of your accessories is probably going to be more important than how much you're tapering them. Um, I think that really the only things that I'm considering in programming when it comes to accessory tapers is just kind of removing the non-essential stuff. In that final week, like like the back work, the shoulder work, the bicep work,
Yep.
that sort of stuff, and then within the other stuff that I'm considering tapering, I'm first thinking about exercise selection, and then I'm thinking about how hard I'm going to be pushing it. So
Right.
obviously selection and intensity, so that comes first.
Yep.
Um,
Fully agreed.
yeah, cool.
And the final two also kind of go hand in hand, whereas travel is going to be partially due to external variables or partially classified as an external variable. So I think if we're talking generally the recovery and externals, I think this is pretty damn important. Um, However, I've seen plenty of times where someone is really stressed out during the week of the meet and everything goes out of whack. Maybe they lose sleep the night before and nothing really happens. So again, I think this also matters in terms of the longevity of how dialed they are. So someone is dialed with the external stuff for an entire macro cycle, maybe slacking off on those or having stressors be higher the week of the meet is probably not the end of the world. However, it's for a longer period of time. It's obviously going to be larger scale. So I think this is probably going to be something, in the top of B, maybe even bottom of A.
Yeah, I'd say so. I think that it, I can't see it really be being grouped with the A tier level stuff like meet week exposure, timing, and frequency. I guess that, sort of recovery and externals allows you to execute the stuff that is in the A tier to the best extent. So it is definitely important, but then again, at the same time, like you said, I've definitely seen people who, their recovery and their external variables are all over the place. Like whether it's traveling to like national level meets, which we'll talk about in a second, um, things are all out of whack and they come in like peaked out of their minds, and it's like
Mhm.
it doesn't seem like it made a difference at all. So yeah, I
I'm
get
down to
that.
put this in somewhere in B. Honestly, like I think it kind of is classified with these like, sure, they're important things, but not crucial. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'd agree.
So I don't know. Maybe we'll just throw it in B for now and adjust if we feel like it's needed.
Mhm. And then the final one here is travel. So travel is something that gets a lot of buzz in the community as to like how important it actually is, how much it affects people's top ends and everything like that. I think that there's data that says, international competition totals are just lower than domestic totals, and that's fine to consider. But I think that for most people, on average, travel is not like a huge thing to consider, especially if we're traveling just locally to a meet. Maybe you're driving a couple of hours, a couple hour flight. Like it's really not a big deal, but it can be a big deal if you don't plan for it accordingly.
Hmm.
If you're taking a flight into a national level meet and you're supposed to land, I don't know, 4 hours before you weigh in or something like that, then it's like, dude, you're setting yourself up for failure. If your flight gets delayed, you're screwed. Uh,
Yeah.
and so I think it comes down to just like the individual and how well they plan essentially. Um, and so, but if you're traveling well and you get to a meet a day or two early, you come prepared with food and everything that you need. If you're executing a cut, you're staying at a nice place, nice bed, like it's really not a big deal at all. So I think traveling is what you make of it. It can be a big issue if you mess it up. At the same time, it can really not even be a consideration if you do it well. So
Right.
I would say that probably puts it in like a C tier consideration, especially when it comes to programming. Only thing you might have to worry about is like gym access or something like that. Um,
Yep. I kind of view this similarly to comp equipment access, where it could make or break, but ultimately, you're probably going to be fine. A way I like to view this is like travel is going to impact a training week for sure. But if we're just trying to peak into one day, odds are you can manage. And if you organize things in a way that it's like, okay, I need to make sure I have this and that so I come in strong on this day. Sure, pretty easy to do in most cases. But yeah, like if it's a whole week of training and you need to like account for training like while on vacation, for example, and you're traveling and all these other things are going to be impacted for a longer period of time. I think that's a different story. So, yeah, I think top of C is probably a good spot for that, in my opinion.
Agreed. All right, so I think we got a pretty good list here. There are some things we might want to move around before we make the post, but I think for the most part we're pretty solid.
Yeah, I think we'll leave everything like in the same tier here,
Might just
and maybe just like flip flop them and reorganize them within their tiers. But I think they're ordered pretty appropriately here.
sweet.